Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to I Just Need a Minute, your weekly encouragement from the faith community. As you hop on in, please let us know that you're here. Give us a shout out in the comments, something. Let us know that you're logging on. And please feel free to go ahead and share this with someone who you think might need a little bit of encouragement tonight. So tonight, we're wrapping up Therapy and Theology Month. I can't believe this is the last thing for Therapy and Theology Month. No pressure, right? But I'm really excited to spend some time with you this evening. So I know that as KSMR, I am pretty well known for having the Bob Ross voice, for doing meditations and whatnot. But tonight I thought I'd shake things up a little bit. I have some reflections that I want to share with you all that I don't think meditation or prayer would be an appropriate platform for. So I want to invite you to cozy up in your favorite chair, grab a warm beverage, and just be open to some reflective type things for this evening. So tonight, as we wrap up Therapy and Theology Month, I want to talk to you for a few minutes about this idea of treasures in the dark. Okay, so treasures in the dark is what we're going to be thinking about tonight. So when I was a kid, I was terrified of the dark. Slept with a nightlight every night through middle school, like all the way through 8th grade, until my parents took the nightlight out of my room when I was about to start high school, because they said, Kali, teenagers, high schoolers do not sleep with a nightlight. You can't do this anymore. And I was still just really anxious about like something happening in the dark, because we as a culture have this obsession with, crimes happening at night, or the scary movies are always set at night, or just all of these bad things happen in the dark. And that's something that I internalized, like, even though I never watched stuff that was terribly scary, you could ask anyone, you can ask my wife, like even the most like just shallow of like level of scariness gives me nightmares, even to this day. So I was just like not a big fan of the dark. But then in college, I spent 3 summers working at a summer camp, right? And we were in the middle of nowhere in the woods of the Smoky Mountains, one of the most beautiful places on the planet, in my opinion. And one of the weekly activities we did with our kids was a night hike. So the way that worked was after dinner, we'd kill some time, hang out a little bit, play some games. Then we would take each counselor would take their group of campers up the mountain to this place called David's Bald. It was this little foothill in the Smokies. And we would just hang out. We would sing songs. We would do silly sketches and stuff like that until the sun started to go down. As the sun went down, we went down a little bit of ways down the mountain to a place that was a bit flatter. And then we stayed there and learned a little bit more about what was in God's creation at night. And we stayed there until it got so dark that you could barely see your hand in front of your face without a flashlight. Right? Really just relying on your night vision. And once it was that dark, we guided the kids down the mountain. Because if you think about kids, particularly if they're in the city or whatnot, they never really have that really immersive experience in the dark. And I remember the first time doing that, I was terrified, but I couldn't let my campers know that, right? So anyway, when we were walking, we were quiet, because we wanted to notice the things that we couldn't normally notice in the day, right? So a couple of times on the hike, you would hear a barn owl off in the distance, and you can't hear that in the daytime. There were a couple of times that we would see this plant called foxfire, which is this really cool kind of fungusy type thing that glows in the dark, so you can really only see it at night. So it was in this experience that I began to realize that there are treasures in the dark. Right. So when I think about darkness in a Christian context, a lot of times we talk about darkness as something that's evil or not good or really just unpleasant. Even though in Genesis chapter 1, when God is making the created order, God separates the day and the night, and he calls the darkness good. One of my favorite preachers and authors, Barbara Brown Taylor, talks about this a lot in her book, Learning to Walk in the Dark. And I really want to encourage you to look at that, because it's really just about saying these dark places or these dark seasons maybe aren't necessarily bad. And even more than that, there might be some holy treasures that we can find along the way. I want to make it super clear. I'm not implying that I think God makes bad things happen in our lives in order to teach us things. That's not what I believe at all. I believe that sometimes bad things happen. That's just life. There's nothing we can do about that. But God still shows up to teach us lessons there. God still shows up to bring goodness and life there. So as we think of this idea of treasures in the dark, I think there are three things that we need to think about when we go looking for treasures in the dark. There are three things we need. The first thing we need is we need a map. We need something that gives us guideposts and lets us know, like, am I moving in a good direction? And for me, one of the most meaningful maps to me is, frankly, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's Stages of Grief. Right, so she argues that there are 5 stages of grief: anger, denial, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And a lot of times when people talk about that, or at least when they post about it on social media, it's like they talk about it in like this really linear progression. Like all of the steps happen in the same order and end at acceptance, and that's just how it works. But really, if you talk to most therapists, they'll tell you it's not a linear experience at all. I like to think of it as a bowl of spaghetti noodles, and every stage of grief is a different noodle. They're all kind of like wound up around each other. It's not really clear where one starts and the other begins. Sometimes you revisit a noodle that you thought you'd already passed over, and that's really what that grief process is like. Right? Because when we're in these stages that feel a little bit dark, that feel a little bit heavy, there are lots of things to grieve. Yeah, sure, we grieve people or pets when they die, but we also grieve relationships. We grieve during transitional periods. We grieve what we may have missed out on when we were a kid for whatever reason. There are lots of things that we can grieve. And for me, those 5 stages of grief are a really helpful map to help me identify where I am in that grieving process. And if I can identify the emotion I'm working through, then I better identify what needs to happen in order to find healing. And sometimes when we explore that map, we find nuggets of healing that maybe we thought weren't possible. And to me, that's the treasure in the dark. So you need a map. The second thing you need is a guide, right? Sometimes the dark can be a really scary place, right? Like, hello, I just told you about how I was afraid of the dark for a really long time as a kid, but was really helpful for our kids at camp who were also afraid of the dark, was having some guides, right? We led them down the mountain single file. There was a counselor in the front, another staff member in the middle, and another counselor at the back, right? Those kids had someone who had been there before and knew what that experience was like. They knew all of the appropriate things to look out for on the map to make sure that we got down the mountain safely. So when you are in your dark spaces too, you need your map and you need your guide. And your guide can come from many places, right? So for me, my guide is my therapist. She's incredibly helpful, but there are so many other things that we can look to for that. Maybe it's a friend who has had a similar experience. Maybe it's a support group like AA. Maybe it's group therapy. There are so many communities that come together to create like peer mentor guides, if you will, for helping us navigate these dark seasons. And honestly, sometimes the relationship you build with your guide is the treasure that you needed. Right? So you need a map, you need a guide. You also need time to explore. Because our culture is so caught up in saying that everything associated with dark is bad, I feel like we spend a lot of times really shying away from anything that's painful, right? Because, frankly, nobody enjoys being in pain, right? But sometimes we don't really have an option. Either we explore the darkness and do it on our own terms and do it in a way that's healthier, or we just kind of let it overwhelm us, right? So we need time to explore. We need to take intentional time to grab your guide, grab your map, and say, hey, I'm a little nervous about this, but I know that I need to do this. I know that I need to go treasure hunting. I need to find those nuggets of healing that will allow me to make it through this season. And in those moments, I believe God meets you. God allows us to find healing and growth, but that's only something that can be done with intentionality. So that's what I want to leave you with tonight. There are treasures to be found in the dark places around you. Don't shy away from them. Embrace them. Allow the divine to join you in that endeavor. And just make sure that you go prepared. Make sure that you got your backpack, that you've got your map, that you've got your guide, and that you give yourself time to do that exploration. I love you all so much. That's it for this evening. I look forward to seeing you all at Bible and Beyond on Saturday.